Happy Friday the 13th, guys, and welcome to part 2 of today's Friday the 13th special. On every Friday the 13th, I like to go back and take one Friday film and kind of break it down and look at it through a deeper lens, I guess. Oddly enough, I did a special for part 2 just a few weeks ago just because I kind of wanted to. But today's Friday the 13th, and today the Friday the 13th that I would like to talk about is the one that started it all in a sense. Not the series, but certainly for Kane Hodder. Today I want to talk to you guys about Friday the 13th, Part 7, The New Blood. I've kind of had varying thoughts on this film over the years, but after rewatching it, I think this is a good one, guys. Looking back at Part 7, I feel like the weight on this one was even more so than the weight that Part 6 had. Which I know may sound a little silly. When Part 5 came out and everybody was upset that there was no Jason at the time, Part 6 came back and there was an objective. What was that objective? Bring back Jason. It was a straightforward job that was done very well by Tom McLaughlin. What do you do after that? How do you carry the baton even further? Well, Jason's back, people are happy, but now we're back to the same problems we had before. How long do we keep going? How do we keep it interesting? That seems like a pretty tough job if you ask me. One of the things that made this series so special, and it's something that's quite frankly lacking in horror today, Frank Mancuso Jr. would just take directors from odds and ends places, finding guys that were really in need to make a name for themselves or to have their breakthrough directorial, which sounds like such a foreign thing today because now it's all about who's the hottest director, how good did his last movie do, when back then they would say, hey, that John Carl Buechler guy, he's a really good effects artist. He probably knows how to edit well and set up stuff. Let's let him do this next Friday the 13th. And boy, am I glad he did. John Carl Buechler ended up becoming a really good director. What are they going to do with Part 7? Add a telekinetic character? Well, that's interesting. On paper, it kind of sounds silly. But I would argue that it's probably not as silly as it sounds when you watch it in the movie. Lar Park Lincoln tries to play a realistic character in that sense, and I think there's a little bit of subjectivity as to how well it comes and plays off. But the interesting thing is I don't feel like a character like Tina would have worked pre-zombie Jason. There's a lot more supernatural elements obviously from Part 6 on, and I think that's where the magic lies in the second half of the Friday the 13th series, especially the Paramount films. I feel like there's a little bit more range of things you can do and pushing the envelope a little bit. After all, this Jason is completely undead. But the real winner here for me is Terry Kaiser performing as Bad News Cruz. Bad News Cruz is a doctor that I would think could come out of any Rob Zombie film or something like that. It almost plays like Dr. Loomis in Halloween 2. Here's a doctor that it's time to make some money. We gotta exploit this stuff. Dr. Cruz needs to exploit Tina's telekinetic ability for him to become some sort of breakout doctor and be able to document all this stuff to make probably a lot of money one day. Does he really want to help Tina? I think there's maybe a little shred of him that wants to. He is a human after all. I think the large majority of it was him getting her there, trying to piss her off and have her perform. Some of those scenes actually look pretty cool. There's one scene where she moves like a matchbook or something on the desk and then it bursts into flames. There is some sort of like a whimsical nature to it, but then again, it's telekinesis. Who's to say what that's supposed to really look like anyway? One of the things about the movie I'll kind of praise and also kind of criticize at the same time. This one, in my opinion, is almost like the B version of the cast from Friday the 13th Part 4, The Final Chapter. I think when you look at the final chapter, you could say that's one of the greatest casts in a slasher film. Everybody has such these unique personalities and it's great. But in Part 7, I feel like it's just almost the B version. But I also want to say that individual, you could kind of pick them apart and say, it's just not good enough, or this character's okay. But when you do put them together, I do feel like that magic happens, and I do like seeing all the cast interact with each other. But speaking of magic, we've got to talk about Kane Hodder in this role. Now, obviously, I'm not going to get into the boring facts about how this was his first film and all, but is it just me, or do you guys sense a different kind of performance in 7 that you really don't see specifically from Kane again? Now, obviously, you'll see all his mannerisms and the things that he does in the films again, but it's almost like he really had something to prove in 7. There is a intensity in 7 that I think is incredible. There's one scene where Tina uses her telekinetic ability to pop Jason's mask off, and the look in Kane's face is insane. It's a guy who had basically a Cinderella story. When you see that look in his face, to me, what I see is a guy burned himself alive, survived it, made it to play an iconic character like Jason. Also, a guy who the producers weren't big on playing Jason, but Buechler went to bat for him, so he wasn't going to let him down. That's what I see in that eye of Kane Hodder when that mask comes off. I also applaud Kane for doing some really physical stuff here, between buildings falling on him and getting lit on fire again after having his brutal accident. It just shows the kind of person he is. I can see why Kane Hodder is a lot of people's favorite Jasons. Quite frankly, he's my favorite Jason. And as a matter of fact, when you look at the 4 movies that Kane did, there's fan bases for each, but something about 7, there's an intensity and a drive, and I just get the feeling that he had something to prove in Part 7. I think this is Kane's best outing as the character, hands down. There's always going to be quirks about Part 7 that don't make it my absolute favorite, of course. Barbara Sachs, the associate producer, axing all the cool stuff, and even axing stuff that made the movie make less sense. You remember at the end of the film when Tina's dad pops out of the lake and pulls Jason down? Now, I guess you could argue that it's some kind of whimsical scene where it really is like not her dad, but maybe some kind of apparition of her dad pulling Jason down. If he's really down there still, well, he's supposed to pretty much look decrepit and gross, like some sort of zombie himself. Pops up like he just was taking a swim 5 minutes ago and just popping up for air. So stuff like that will always make the film not perfect. I do want to argue with John Carl and Kane in one instance. I don't think that the sleeping bag kill is at its best with one hit the way it was done in the film. I've seen that footage online of Kane taking that sleeping bag and beating the piss out of it against the tree. I definitely think it looks cooler and gnarlier when he goes at it again and again. So being plagued by the MPAA and an associate producer that basically just wanted to make everybody's life a living hell on set is always going to hinder Part 7. But I would also argue in the hands of a lesser guy, Kane Hodder, coming into the fray, they needed 2 guys with something to seriously prove no matter what. And I think that's what makes Part 7 as badass as it is, which is the word that comes to mind when I think of Friday the 13th: The New Blood. Badass. Kane comes in with something to prove. You've got a really stylish visual director who's really great at makeup effects, and you've got a cast that together have that magic. So when I look back, I think Part 7 had a lot more to prove than Part 6 did. Part 6 needed to get Jason back, but Part 7 had to carry it forward even more. And I would say that it did. When you look at the box office, it didn't really wane that much at all. Looking back, guys, Part 7 is one of those Friday films that you have to give it its credit. Number 1, it's a Part 7. Number 2, you had a guy coming in to play Jason that nobody believed at the studio besides the director. Number 3, you had a director who had his back up against the wall, quite frankly, make a Part 7 good. And I think it all kind of comes together. Is it the best Friday the 13th? Well, that's up for you to decide. Do I think it is? No, but I think it's damn close. Also, the addition of Fred Mullen's score is something I really love. Those haunting descending keys that you hear when Jason's about to get resurrected and then the water starts bubbling is just as much Friday the 13th to me as what Harry Manfredini did with his legendary scores. Fred Mullen was a welcomed addition, in my opinion, to the Friday the 13th series. Guys, going back and watching Part 7 for this year's Friday the 13th, I gotta say, I think Part 7 is a damn good Friday the 13th film. Going back and watching the film with a little bit of hindsight of knowing what happened behind the scenes with Kane and John, I think it's a film you really have to give it its props for. It had its back up against the wall big time, and I think it delivered on all fronts. What is your thoughts on The New Blood? When's the last time you've gone back and revisited it? I also think that these films can be seen through different lenses when you watch them just on a one-off as opposed to binging them. I think you can appreciate it a little bit more that way. So why don't you take this evening and check out The New Blood. Happy Friday the 13th. Huge giant thank you to all of my Patreon supporters. Without you guys, this would not be possible. To get behind the scenes photos, videos, music, private live streams, and much more, you can subscribe to my Patreon for as little as $1 a month. Thank you to my patrons.